Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Low Carb Lifestyle Long Weekend today. You are in for a really fantastic treat. We're here with Sarah Hancock, and Sarah is going to share a whole lot of information around oral health and links between our oral health and our metabolic health. Sarah, thank you so much for being part of the summit.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of the summit, Tracy. It's an honour and a privilege to be here. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing all the other presentations as well too. It's going to be fantastic.
Yes, fantastic. Since as recording this, I've only got a couple more of the interviews to go, and the presentations are all coming in and they are fantastic. And I find it fascinating because there's definitely, this theme obviously running through, the whole summit, that insulin resistance is such a big issue. But then, then we get underneath all that, and there's lots of little nuances and, people talking about their area of expertise. And I just find that so fascinating then that we get to make it really individual and make it work for us. But we've got such a great body of amazing people like yourself sharing the work that they've done. So yeah, we're the ones that are honoured to have you. So would you like to just maybe introduce yourself, share with everyone a little bit about who you are and I guess how we came to talk?
How we came to talk? Well, I emailed you. Well, my name is Sarah Hancock, and I've just completed a PhD in public health nutrition at Auckland University of Technology, where I looked at dental health and metabolic health from the common dietary links, and also how we might look at intervening to improve dental health, because if we're going to improve child dental health, which is actually one of the most chronic conditions that children experience, it's one of the leading causes of hospitalisation in children. But if you can intervene with families in a way to improve dietary intake, it's probably going to have a positive impact on everyone's health, including their general and metabolic health going forward. Because what we do know is that with the common dietary cause of poor oral health, so shown in dental caries, but also periodontal disease as people become older. And also it's very tightly linked to metabolic health through the same metabolic and hormonal pathways in which, type 2 diabetes develops, and which obviously raises risk for cardiovascular disease, neurological disorders, cancer, and a whole range of other non-communicable disease problems. So that's sort of where I started doing that. I'm a parent of two now teenage girls, and I live in Taupo in the central North Island. And so there was a range of reasons how I came to be studying child health and carbohydrate consumption. When I was 10 years old, my 8-year-old sister was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So we, as a family, we were very quickly launched into a life of being very aware of the impact of food on general health, well, on my sister's health, and that, the failure to eat breakfast, for instance, was going to have quite a impact on how she was later in the day. And then time went on and we all grew up, and my younger daughter was about 12 years ago diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And so then we started looking at, again, the foods that she was to have. And we've found that a lot of the foods that we were recommended were, pretty revolting, actually, especially around that time. But there was lots of sugar and in these foods, and it was just, but we were told that we should have this because of fiber and, the importance of carbohydrate. And I was starting to have some questions about that. The low-carbohydrate, healthy fat movement was starting to pick up through the last decade through the work of Grant Schofield and Karen Zinn at AUT as well. And, of course, that made sense, and it sort of was, I was reading about that at the same time as I was becoming more and more interested in child nutrition again, and because I had a background in health research analysis as well too. And then, was busy doing other things, and then we were living in Christchurch at the time of the earthquakes, and our house was quite badly damaged, and so that took 5 years to get that resolved. And so, of course, once that was resolved in 2016, I sort of started thinking, well, I was in my mid-40s, so where to now? So I decided to do a PhD and made contact. As you do. Yeah. And I'm very lucky to be married to my lovely husband, Colin, who's a physiotherapist here and who didn't think it was nuts to do a PhD while living in the central North Island and, 3.5 hours drive away from Auckland. So he's been hugely supportive of that. And I've been very, very lucky to have a supportive family. But I've also been really lucky to be able to do the original research and data collection in the Taupo area, which is, quite typical of sort of semi-rural, somewhat urbanised. I mean, the town itself is, Greater Taupo is about 22,000 people. But, I was able to sort of do research in a group that might not typically be studied as part of PhD research and in child health as well too. So it's been a really interesting journey. Yeah. And we've got modern technology these days, very similar to, what's enabling us to do this, that I could, that it's meant that doing a PhD by distance learning or distance hasn't been so onerous as what it might have otherwise been. Yeah. So that's sort of how I got to studying, public health nutrition and doing this PhD in that area. And it's been fascinating. It really has. Yeah.
So interesting. Couple of things. So in terms of your PhD, what did you actually find what you were hoping to find or what you were expecting to find? Like, what did you start out wanting to know and wanting to answer? And, I think we all come into it with a hypothesis. And what did you find in the end with that?
What I found is, we had a general idea that, when I looked up, what puts children into hospital, what makes children sick? And, so we spend, as the taxpayer in New Zealand, $132,000 a day on the removal under general anaesthetic of multiple teeth in preschoolers. And we'll get up tomorrow and do the same thing. And we do know that 42% of Australian children will experience dental caries by the time they're 5 years old. And so there was some questions about that, and sort of think, okay, well, most of the promotion is around oral hygiene, and why is that when it is a disease of dietary origin was acknowledged as such, by the 1930s, and that prevention by dietary means was the main thing. So, and then realised that the dietary guidelines in New Zealand weren't exactly lining up with the evidence. And so then we sort of think, and then there's also a paucity of interventions looking at whether you can improve dental health and general metabolic health with a dietary intervention. There's been plenty on dietary intervention for metabolic health, and there's been plenty on a range of interventions with oral hygiene and education and advice to reduce sugars, which is really quite vague. And then sort of thought, okay, well, if you're going to design a further intervention, you need to access the knowledge of your targets of your intervention, but also that of your health professionals who are involved. And then given that knowledge, what are the barriers that people experience to eating well on the basis of that knowledge? What stops people eating optimally? So there's been a range of things. We've found that, we've looked at the burden of dental caries and that it's borne disproportionately by people of lower socioeconomic status and in certain ethnic groups. And we also looked at the dietary factors that are also associated with benefit for dental health, but also harm, and then looked at the degree to whether that was reflected in official government-endorsed advice or not. And then we also thought, and then what I decided to do was use a novel card sorting strategy so that we could compare the knowledge of children and parents, but also health professionals, about foods and behaviours, including dietary behaviours that were beneficial for both oral health and general health. And so what we found is that the knowledge of foods for both oral health and general health were broadly aligned with dietary guideline recommendations, which for children involve a frequent intake of carbohydrate-based foods such as breads and cereals. And for growing children, that by the time children reach adolescence, they should be consuming that up to about 6 times per day. But also alongside that is the recommendations to choose low-fat options when consuming dairy produce, and to eat lean meat. But the evidence, and this is not new evidence by any means, suggests that your vitamin D rich products such as your eggs, your meat, and your vitamin K2 rich products, which include your fermented cheeses, are hugely beneficial for dental health because of the bone formation. We know about vitamin D and immune function, but also as far as bone and growth development bone and tooth development goes, it's very, very important, but also really important for maintaining the health of your teeth through the life course and the health of your body through the life course. Yeah. But also the other interesting thing was that the oral hygiene behaviours were uniformly right across the board regarded as the most important strategies for preventing poor dental health. So basically people knew that reducing sugar was a good idea as far as reducing your intake of sugary drinks goes, and also knew that eating vegetables was good for your health. But there was a range of opinions with regard to dairy produce and meat, which is really interesting because it's in those dietary guidelines. There's those caveats around the consumption of meat and dairy, even though the evidence suggests that it's beneficial or that's associated with benefit for oral health.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating that, we can have such solid evidence, yet we take it, package it, and put it out as something else. So, our dietary guidelines here are the same as yours, and we have the same issues. And I just find it really interesting. I talk to people, dietitians that go through and do dietetics, and they learn about insulin resistance and carbohydrates. But now go and teach the dietary guidelines. So, it really defies belief, because again, we're looking at, in terms of our oral health, such a disconnect between the dietary guidelines, what we're told to do, and the reality of the research. So why is that? In your opinion?
How long do we have?
As long as you like.
Yeah, the oral health, it's really interesting because I think, back 80, 90 years ago, it was really well established that vitamin D rich products, and there were some small studies done by Edward and May Mellanby in the UK in the 1920s, and they had these children, and they found that they could actually reverse the white spot lesions, which is the first stage of the dental caries process in the mouth, by getting these kids to not eat oatmeal porridge, but replace that in the morning with eggs and sardines and fish and grass-fed beef, because it was all grass-fed beef back then. And they found that they could actually reverse dental caries, and that actually those spot lesions fix themselves very much in a similar way, which when we immobilize a cracked bone, we just let the body get on and heal it. And so a similar sort of mechanism happens in the mouth, where you've got, your calcium phosphate and, fluoride-rich saliva. It's got a number of ions, and it buffers the teeth. But if it's the repeated intake of fermentable carbohydrates, that actually means that, there's bacteria that produce acids as a response of the metabolism of the carbohydrate, drops the pH, and so that's when you get the enamel demineralization in the mouth. And then what happened at around about the same time is there was this competing idea of how dental caries forms, and that came down to the buildup of plaque. And for instance, back in the 1920s, when they were getting on top of things like tuberculosis, or oral hygiene or an unclean mouth was regarded as implicated in tuberculosis. And so therefore the oral hygiene companies, and then there was prominent dentists who set up oral hygiene schools, got right into this. And they, because they could make money off just scraping off stuff off teeth. And so that became a competing theory. And of course, the sugar industry were right on top of this, because they were into, well, just eat whatever you like, as long as you clean your teeth, you'll be fine. And so that became and how that became a cornerstone of oral health prevention advice is just fascinating. That there was a Council of Dental Therapeutics that was tied up with the American Dental Association, and they tried to assess the evidence, and they found that there was no evidence for any therapeutic benefit, and that these oral hygiene products should belong in the aisle with the lipsticks and the mascara and beauty products and that sort of thing.
Wow.
But of course, then they lost advertising revenue, and then they were sued because they were claiming that there was no therapeutic benefit, and there was a toothpaste company that sued the American Dental Association. So of course they were losing advertising revenue. Oh, I know, it's fascinating, really.
When did this happen? When did you say this
This
happened?
was in the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Yeah, right.
But that sort of grew from, so we've got this oral hygiene movement, and that coalesced from some of those social hygiene movements that were led by the progressive reformers, which Belinda Fedke has talked about at length, and she's done a range of marvellous presentations about the Kellogg's and the ideology behind that. And so we've got a similar thing happening with the oral hygiene industry. And now, 80, 90 years later, in the central North Island of New Zealand, we've got a whole lot of parents, kids, and health professionals believing that oral hygiene is your main preventive strategy for tooth decay prevention, and that these strategies are the cornerstone of public health advice and oral health promotion initiatives, alongside very general advice to reduce sugars. But can you imagine, it must have been a bit tricky being a dentist when the dietary guidelines first came out in 1977. Can you imagine it? They've been going along on the basis, we'll just reduce the consumption of these foods and, give your teeth a break, so that your saliva can remineralize your teeth. And then, of course, the dietary guidelines come out. Not only are they recommending an increased consumption of fermented, refined carbohydrate-based foods like breads and cereals, but there's also recommendations to reduce consumption of meat and dairy and saturated fat, which is a really good source of the vitamins as well too. So there's that sort of conflict there as well, and so of course then that leads into the increased promotion of oral hygiene strategies for caries prevention, and
That is
where diet was just minimized in that.
Fascinating, and obviously very similar to so many areas, in terms of our health. There's and they're so far in it that getting out of it is just so difficult now, isn't it? And that's why I say to a lot of my clients, if you're going to sit and wait for the dietary guidelines to change or the government recommendations to change, unfortunately, you're probably going to be in very poor health by the time that happens, if you're going to still be here. And at the moment, it has to be a groundswell of individuals that, will bring change from the ground up, because the disconnect is so huge between, the science and the evidence and what we're told to do.
I think in some ways I've been quite lucky that I wasn't a dentist, because, dentists are all trained in all these strategies. Even at AUT, there's an oral health science course, and they train oral hygiene therapists. So it's kind of like an industry sort of is. It's fascinating how.
Do you think? Sorry, I was going to say, do you think that they would get taught nutrition?
I think they get taught nutrition, but in very generalist terms, and that most times you go to a dentist, you'll get this very general advice to reduce sugars, and people sort of go, well, I don't drink fizzy drink and that sort of thing. In fact, but you don't get the advice to, this is why you need it. It's because of, there's a few dentists out there that do it. Dr. Stephen Lynn in Australia is amazing. And then there's Mark Buchan, and there's the dentists in the upper North Island here who are very, very good. But in general, it's just this very broad spectrum advice to reduce sugars, but there's nothing, or to reduce, just to try not to go grazing or anything like that. But that's sort of conflicts with dietary guideline advice, which, especially for children growing up, they're recommending that we have bread and cereal-based products up to 6 times a day. as children get older, and there's no evidence for that at all. Yeah, so I think it is difficult, and I think we need more awareness of the harms of all these ultra-processed foods, and not just your really obvious culprits, but also things like your muesli bars, your breads, some of the cereals, which are marketed as being healthy and fortified with vitamin D or whatever, or folate or everything else. Yeah.
So maybe we could talk about a little bit specific just around that then. So what is the problem with those foods as such when it comes to our teeth?
I think there's a range of mechanisms by which these foods are harmful. One is the sheer amount of sugar in them, and that has an effect not only as an outside-in response with what happens in the oral cavity of the mouth when we have, you have some sugar, it drops the pH of the plaque, so there's bacteria that produce acid, the acid demineralizes it, but we also know, and it hasn't really escaped out of the scientific literature, is that there's another process going on in which teeth are malnourished through a high sugar diet. And so that's all got to do, and it's very closely linked to how, hyperinsulinemia, and that, you have a high sugar diet and with a high frequency intake of sugar. And that, of course, increases the metabolism of the mitochondria in the hypothalamus, which, of course, produces reactive oxygen species that leads to more inflammation. And that inflammatory cycle of inflammation and glycation and oxidative stress, while it also increases insulin production or secretion from the pancreas, it also has an effect on the parotid hormone, which is the largest salivary gland. Okay, so you've got this parotid gland, which secretes saliva, and it also secretes parotid hormone. This is the really as sciencey and technical as this is going to get. And so what happens then is that we also have this fluid that nourishes our teeth from the root up. So, you've got this fluid that sort of comes up through your teeth through the pulp, and that centrifugal flow actually nourishes the dentin, which is the next layer of dental tissue under the enamel. And so, of course, what happens with a high sugar diet is that has an effect on the parotid hormone or the parotid gland. So that stops the secretion of the parotid hormone, which then turns off the nourishment of the tooth internally.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fascinating and I started reading about that because I knew that there's different ways that we get acid into our mouths, and for instance, there's citrus fruit drinks, but there's also the people who get reflux, or people with bulimia. They'll experience tooth erosion, but they don't experience that decay to the same degree of the dentin, and therefore the cavitation of the tooth and the shear damage to the tooth. But so I started reading around a little bit more of that and got into that whole hormonal, those hormonal and metabolic pathways by which a high sugar diet has an effect on teeth, which is quite fascinating, really, because all of pretty much what I'd read through exploring oral health and dental caries was very much into bacteria and the oral biome, which of course is important, but it's a dual process. So we've got this process within the mouth, but we've also got an internal process by which that high sugar diet is having an effect hormonally on the parotid gland and the secretion of that fluid for nourishment of the teeth.
It's fascinating stuff. And we talked before we started recording about how this is just so there's just so not enough information out there about this. And, there probably is a lot of vested interest squashing a lot of the information.
It's actually really, when you go and even do a search on cereals and dental caries, you don't get a lot of studies come up. It's really interesting. You sort of most of the time you can pop in a couple of search terms, you can get thousands of studies, but you look at cereals or something quite specific like that and dental caries. So that's one mechanism by which a diet that's got a very high proportion of refined foods, but it also displaces foods that are nutrient rich out of the diet, because when you're eating a whole lot of ultra processed foods, you're not consuming the meats, so your whole foods that actually have a number of vitamins and minerals which are important for oral health, especially your fat soluble vitamins such as vitamin E, vitamin D3 and vitamin K2, which the research in that area is just exploding, particularly given its role in calcification, ensuring that calcium is deposited where you want it to in your hard tissues like your teeth and your bones, but you don't want it being deposited in your soft tissues, which has implications for dental plaque as well too. So there's the high refined carbohydrate diet, which has an effect on metabolic health, as you well know, but also has an effect on the nourishment of the tooth. There's the displacement of foods, but also there's the other hormonal element of it all, is that with all this advice to have a high and frequent intake, of course that's damaging to tooth health, but it's in line with some of those addictive behaviors which we see with sugar addiction, because all these foods are packaged and marketed in such a way that drives further increased consumption of those foods, as opposed to, say, if you have a nice fat and protein rich meal, you're not that hungry afterwards.
Right.
There's the satiety associated with those foods is just so much greater, particularly protein, and protein is just really important as far as your oral health goes as well too.
Yeah. Well, there you go. It's just another reason, because it's come out obviously across everything. It's so important for our brain. It's so important for our organs, for our muscles. And now it's really important for our teeth. So I want to ask you then, I recorded a chat with a liver surgeon and the other day, and he talks about the liver as being the canary in the coal mine. Developing fatty liver is kind of the first sign of poor metabolic health. But I wonder, talking to you, could it be more that maybe our teeth, and the fact if we're getting cavities and issues with our teeth, is that more likely that first place that we'll see sign of issues?
I think we do, particularly in children.
Right.
We do know that very young children with decaying teeth, and I'm talking about toddlers here, they're quite often underweight, Tracy, when they present with tooth decay, because what's happened is that this has started developing almost as soon as the teeth are cut and coming through. That might just be having, there's a range of dietary behaviours there, but those kids can be quite underweight and malnourished, because what's going on is that there's pain in their mouth. They don't have the language to say, my mouth is sore. So they might be these people that sort of turn up as fussy eaters, or are classified as fussy eaters, and their parents get worried that they're not having enough at meal times of the foods that they should be having. And so they start this dietary behavior of grazing by going into the pantry, and they're eating foods that break down very quickly in the mouth, because we know that even bread type foods, that often consumed by that age group with jam or honey on the top, is that the starches in those foods work to actually keep the sugar on the teeth for longer. And so that's just a longer period of time that the teeth are exposed to those foods. And so then they never actually turn up to dinner being fully hungry to actually eat a meal, because there's been a pattern of grazing. And so it's a dietary behavior that started very early on, is grazing on foods that break down very quickly in the mouth and that don't require as much chewing, because we know that just the forces of chewing actually are really good for the jaw development as well too. So those kids finish up being quite underweight, and so which is why the evidence is quite mixed with regard to obesity in children and dental caries. So in the very young children, they are often more underweight, but by the time they're in later childhood and early adolescence, they might be starting to become more overweight and have dental caries as well too. And that's an early indicator that actually there's, things are not going well metabolically, but also that a whole family might be eating like that as well too, because there's a dietary habit there. So while we know that there are really high rates of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in teenagers and young people now, actually the presence of dental caries is a really loud, or should be regarded as a really loud alarm bell that things are not going well. And because we do know that children who have had dental caries as young children, they'll grow up and continue experiencing that in adulthood. Yeah. Yeah. So it is it's quite a loud alarm bell, and is a canary in the coal mine. And in the same way that, issues with the oral biome are also reflected in the gut biome as well too. Yeah.
Yeah. But we never talk about the oral biome. We always talk about the gut biome, but that's
we don't talk about. Yeah, and it's interesting because the mouth is the very top of a gastrointestinal system. And when my children were really young, I went to this display at the Canterbury Museum, and it was all about the human body. And so you could actually do the gastrointestinal system. So you went up this little child's playground slide, and that was the mouth. The ladder was just the mouth, and you went down the slide, and it was kind of like a game of snakes and ladders that you walked yourself along, and then you had to crawl through a tunnel at the end, and there are all these toilets lined up there. And it was really cool fun. And so, but most of this game, called the gastrointestinal system, was pretty much everything that happened after the throat. But there was no acknowledgement, or there was nothing about what's going on, because the digestion of food actually first starts taking place in the mouth. But the dental health thing was, well, like it is always, just somewhere else in the building. In fact, I think it was on a completely different floor. But that's sort of, and I can remember I was thinking about that actually at one point last year when I was finishing the write-up of this thesis, that actually it's a really clear example of how this is, the mouth health is completely displaced from general health, but they're integrally linked, and especially with diet. Yeah. And I think also through the life course, we know that there's poor wound healing and kidney problems and eyesight problems and cardiovascular disease and neurological problems that come along with type 2 diabetes. But periodontal disease and tooth loss is, really common in that group. And that's it's an inflammatory disorder and widely recognized as such. But there is that mechanism of a long and chronic intake of dietary refined carbohydrates that's behind that, because of the inflammatory cycles that's going on. So you can imagine how that goes for older groups, where there's that alveolar bone loss around the tooth. And so then there's tooth loss, and then it makes it even more difficult to chew real food. And then you look at the diets that many people are fed at rest homes and in hospitals, and it's just a cascading mess, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. So I definitely want to start getting a little bit practical in terms of, I guess, my audience for mums. What could we do where we are now, but also, really some advice on the kids. But my first question before we get to that is talking about the liver again. The regenerative capacity of the liver is amazing. We can reduce fatty liver in a matter of weeks with changing our diet. Phenomenal, right? It is phenomenal. So is there a regenerative capacity with our teeth as well? So if we're sitting here, say we're in our 40s, let's talk about me for a second. I had 6 fillings at the age of 6.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. Yep. So, I didn't think anything of it. I don't think my mother did either, at that sort of time. I'm nearly 48 now. So since, I guess I kind of followed the dietary guidelines. One thing I never did was eat a huge amount of processed food, because I think to me it kind of just, but I did eat toast and oats and porridge. So I did have plenty of that. But I guess I kind of always, in adulthood, I've never had any issues with my teeth. Now, 40, I turned low carb, got rid of a whole lot of the refined stuff and the carbohydrates. And then for the last year now, I've been carnivore. And yes. And look, I was just talking to my husband before about, about chatting to you. And I just said to him, I wonder, if this whole oral health thing, teeth brushing, now with the diet that I'm on, wouldn't it be interesting if I stopped cleaning my teeth for a month and saw what happened?
Well, that's really interesting, because a lot of people who report being carnivores have actually then go along to the dental hygienists, and after being told off for not having gone for years or
that's
months, they actually have a look in their mouths and go, well, there's actually really nothing to scrape off. And that's quite interesting, because we also know about, because the process by which the tartar or your calcified plaque forms isn't terribly well understood. But essentially what it is, it's calcified plaque. And, there's a school of thought out there amongst some dentists that actually vitamin K2 is tied up in this, because we know that a deficiency of vitamin K2, because what it does is it's an activator of vitamin D, but it also activates osteocalcin, which means that your calcium gets deposited in your teeth and your bones where it should do. But it's also really important as far as it also activates MGLA protein, which means that we don't get your calcium deposited in your arteries or in places that you just don't want that stuff blocking up. And so there's a school of thought out there that reckons that actually it's got implications in plaque formation and the calcification of the plaque, because plaque is actually just hardened oral biofilm, and it just sits at the bottom of your teeth and then gets scraped off, and you're told that actually doing that is going to be the most important thing for your health, is actually getting that removed. It's one of those things. But there's a number of people who don't experience that once they go on a very low carbohydrate or ketogenic or carnivore diets. And I think that would be just absolutely fascinating to explore further. But they only really isolated or really discovered what vitamin K2 was earlier this century, really. That they always knew that it was different from K1, which is provides you clotting factors. But yes, so that's interesting on that part. But what was the actual question we sort of needed to talk about?
Sorry, I know I took you off there, but is it regenerative? Can our teeth, improve?
Yeah. Once the enamel goes, well, then you actually have to, get that fixed, because, that doesn't get replaced. We can't just sort of grow new enamel. Once that's broken or cavitated and it's a lesion, that needs to be repaired. In the same way that if you crack a bone badly enough, like really, really crack it, you might need a screw insert or something like that.
Right.
The dentin, on the other hand, which is your layer underneath your enamel, and it's sort of constructed like a set of stacked rods, is probably the best way of describing it. That does get regenerated through the use of odontoblasts, which actually are involved, and they need vitamin D, that sort of thing. So that's continually regenerated. But once you actually have enough damage to the enamel, and then that gets damaged as well too, and you get an infection in the pulp, that's where we get the requirement for root canals and things like that. But so your tooth is very much alive, and it continues being nourished also by that centrifugal fluid, which the parotid gland is involved in the secretion of as well too. So yeah, if you keep your tooth well nourished and internally, by not having a high frequency consumption of sugars, your teeth can actually heal themselves quite well. And whereas at an early stage of caries lesions, and so of course what you have is on your enamel, there's a whole lot of bacteria. We've always had them that are working in sort of like this massive little orchestra and just actually maintaining the health of the enamel. And then if you were to develop a caries lesion, which first shows up as a white spot, you can actually get rid of that by dropping the refined carbohydrates out of your diet and having a vitamin D rich diet as well too. So you can actually reverse that process. Which is really exciting, because that's just not very well outlined. People might typically go to a dentist, they'll say, oh, there's a spot there that we need to keep an eye on, but you don't get a lot of advice or specific advice on how to turn that around.
No, you definitely don't.
But you can do that in the same way that if you crack a bone and immobilize it, and just your body can fix that. And so the tooth the enamel has to be pretty tough. It's got to withstand quite a lot, whether it's acid production, but just the grinding, the mere act of digesting food. Your teeth are working pretty hard. Your enamel is the hardest substance in your body.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's harder than bone.
Wow.
And your dentin underneath your enamel is the second hardest surface in your body. Yeah.
It's fascinating. I haven't been to the dentist since pre-COVID, which is, I've never been really good with the dentist.
I haven't been to the dentist since way longer than before that.
Oh, really? Oh, good. I feel better. I remember every time I've gone. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Every time I go, she's kind of like, oh, because I've got all these mercury fillings. She slowly replaced them all. So,
Yeah.
it's, I guess I just, whatever, let's get rid of the mercury out of my mouth. That's probably a good thing. But, she always goes, she's doing the thing and she tells the nurse, how they go through each tooth. And, every time I hear her say, oh, there's toothbrush abrasion. So now I'm kind of thinking, well, if the only thing that's going on is I'm, damaging my teeth by maybe brushing them too much or something like that, I think there's a lot we can be creative and get curious about with all of that, because, I mean, as you said, it's a huge industry, right? So we've got the flossing, the brushing, the mouth washing, and what I know in terms of the gut microbiome, and I'm imagining it's the same with the oral, are we maybe washing away a lot of the good stuff that's actually really protective for our teeth?
We might be. Yeah. Because I think what we know is that, and the anthropological studies are really useful in this, and that, they've studied the plaque and teeth, from way back when, and definitely 10,000 years ago, around the Neolithic times. They did identify at around about the time when we started growing crops, was that there was a reduction in the diversity of the biome, which came accompanied with more decay. And so what we know is that there's a range of bacteria that have existed in the mouth through all societies at all times. But it's if we get an overgrowth of certain bacteria, then we've got a problem. It's kind of like you can keep all sorts of cats as pets, can't you? I mean, if you had a tiger in your backyard, you're going to have some pretty tight controls on that, aren't you? It might need a cage, but, if that gets loose, it's going to cause a whole lot of problems. And so you can still think of the bacteria in your mouth in a similar way, and that when we ingest and chew fermentable sugars in your refined carbohydrates, you're going to get this overgrowth of certain bacteria, and where the metabolism of that is going to actually produce the acids that are actually going to be harmful. But it could be quite a leap that there's toothbrushing erosion, because we do get you can experience erosion through having some lemon drinks. But I mean, if that too much of that, and they do recommend you might have to use softer toothbrush, and that we should probably all be using softer toothbrushes rather than and just not drilling it too hard. But they did this really interesting study in the Swiss Alps. It was part of a reality TV show, and they made these people eat a Stone Age diet, and for about 6 weeks, and basically left them to it. But they didn't give them any oral hygiene. They just said, no, leave them to it. They weren't brushing their teeth or flossing or anything like that. These people were living with their families, who presumably love them very much, and they all love each other very much. But what they found at the end of that is that their periodontal health indicators were really, really good. And it was an unexpected finding that there was just less inflammation going on. But on those probe tests where they go and check out the health of the bone under the gum, I said, well, actually, it's all really, really good. And so if you were eating like that, you just might not need oral hygiene to the same degree. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all go out now, but it is interesting how, a particular flavour has been associated through marketing and advertising, and that we all just quite like that minty clean feeling in our mouth.
Yes, fascinating.
Yeah. And then they came up with that flavour, and they say this is fresh. You wonder what might have happened if they'd chosen a different herb or something like that. But so we've got minty fresh flavour in your mouth, and we've grown to like that, and it's probably been one of the most successful marketing initiatives ever. Insofar as things that we've taken on board, but there's really the evidence around these sorts of strategies is decidedly very, very mixed, because the trials haven't been conducted terribly well, and there's been some issues with that. And so what we're so that's the status of the whole oral hygiene research. And we know that the application of topical gels that contain fluoride, and that fluoride toothpaste is quite a good thing. But you do also have to be quite careful about the amount of toothpaste you put on, especially on a child's toothbrush, because of fluorosis and that sort of thing as well too. But Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. So really, obviously, diet is super important, and it's the one that's really the first thing with every speaker will have talked about that in terms of our oral health specifically. So you talk about a vitamin D rich diet. So in the context of maybe what we feed our kids and what we would feed ourselves, what does a vitamin D rich diet look like? And, because vitamin D is an issue. I mean, it seems to be associated with, our immune health. It's associated with a lot of things. It's obviously very important, yet majority of the population are very low in vitamin D. And I personally was, that's me, I supplement as well. So is there a case too for supplementing and, can we see the benefits with supplementing with vitamin D? Sorry, that's a few questions. So let's start with, what is a vitamin D rich diet then?
Yeah, I think if for mums and kids or families or everyone right across the board, if you eat a diet that's comprised of whole foods, unprocessed foods, but definitely don't, organize meals around protein from animal sources is actually a really good idea. Yeah, it's going to have all sorts of benefits as far as satiety goes, but also for the vitamin D content and the vitamin A and K2 and E content as well too. So I think, just making sure that there's enough protein going into kids as well too, because we just sort of know that that lack of protein is implicated in all sorts of, adverse health outcomes.
And that's really important. Can I just say something on that? Because obviously as a mum, with my kids, I, was fortunate, I think, to discover maybe 8 years ago that, my priority was not about making my kids eat their veggies. It really shifted to, well, protein first. So eat your meat, eat your chicken, eat your fish, eat your eggs, and I really took the whole emphasis off veggies. Look, my kids still eat veggies, but it's not a huge amount of their diet. And I think that's been a really big thing, because I don't know, anyone with kids knows kids hate vegetables. And I just wonder, is there a reason for that?
Well, I think actually there is. And I think we're kind of hardwired to actually eat meat. And, I went through my kids, foods they liked and foods they didn't like. And I never had a problem getting them to eat meat. Ever.
Me neither.
Yeah. I'd eat that first and foremost. And so definitely you sort of think, gosh, maybe we should just leave them to it and stop worrying about the vegetable thing quite so much. But and I think that's possibly the source of those sorts of battles, is that actually if we just put protein in its place as just like a really important part of children's diets, and particularly from animal sources because of the vitamins and minerals that they can access in easily bioavailable forms, that's a good place to start. And and have that as a center point within a diet that's organized around whole foods, whether it's eggs and bacon or eggs and whatever in the mornings, but rather than cereals, is probably the best place for families to start. But I think that what we've discussed as far as dental health, it's just another really good reason to eat like this. Keep the carbs low, keep the healthy fats up, and also the protein intake is really quite important as well too, for the growth and development of kids. But especially when we know that actually there's a number of problems with a low protein intake through the life course, especially with the number of women who are iron deficient, is really an issue as well too. So I think that's a really important message for women in particular through the life course. And I think, possibly some of the recommended daily intakes leaves a lot of people underserved as far as protein intake goes. Yeah. So I think that's important. But I think, like the message that you'll be getting from all your presenters is that just that whole food, with minimal sugar and, minimally processed foods are the way to go, especially for families and kids. But definitely proteins and fats are important for oral health as well as general metabolic health. Yeah.
So do you have any knowledge or data on, vitamin D supplements, for people that are vitamin D deficient?
I think supplementation is a really good idea if you're deficient. You know, I mean, all the advice, you know, does exist. I mean, I didn't look so much at supplementation, but I just looked mainly through vitamin D rich foods and, you know, comparing that with, you know, ultra processed foods that are not delivering those vitamins and minerals in as much bioavailable form. But I think supplementation, I think especially with what we're going through globally at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think in at-risk groups, I think supplementation is a really good idea, particularly given that it's implicated in adverse, or, you know, vitamin D deficiency is implicated in adverse outcomes, but also the dosing or treatment with vitamin D has actually reduced the risk of experiencing adverse outcomes, you know, if hospitalized with COVID-19, which I think is really important. But I think, you know, one of the best things we can do for our health is just getting outside and doing all that. I mean, even when you look back at some of that research around, you know, those early explorers of Antarctica, for instance. Now, the first guy to get there was Roald Amundsen, and he came from Norway. And you go and read about how they kept healthy down there and managed to get to the South Pole and back. And they took an excess number of dogs so that if they didn't find enough to shoot down there, they could have a dog. Terrible. I hope there's not too many children listening now, but they lived it very much a diet that was organized around plenty of meat and fat. And actually, I was in Norway. This was years and years ago in my previous life, in my mid-20s, on holiday, and we went to this little Norwegian stave church, and we were waiting for the boat to take us back to where we were staying. And so we decided to go and have a look at the cemetery and just sort of, you know, there was nothing really else to do. They'd shut the church. And it was very rare for people to die young there. And this was on the side of a hill in a place where it rained 330 days a year. Could you imagine? Yeah, so of course growing crops wasn't even a thing. And so there was a few cows and a few sheep running around. But basically the main way these people earn a living is by fishing. And so you think, well, these people were strong, fit, hardy people who lived to a very long time, you know, 100, 150, 200 years ago. And so you sort of think, well, there's something in that. You know, there's not a lot of sunshine there, but there was no evidence that these people were ridden with poor health. And the only things that killed people young were childbirth and being lost at sea.
Wow.
Yeah. Like if they got to a certain age and managed to survive the workplace, they did all right. Yeah.
It's just fascinating. There's so much we can learn, you know, from stories like that. But, you know, then we just love to change it to suit our own beliefs and, you know, our
lifestyle. I mean, we're just not outside enough, are we? I mean,
no,
here we are sitting inside today.
Yeah, although we're going out when we finish. But yeah, I agree. It's everything, isn't it? You know, you don't generally work, you know, physically anymore. You know, our physical health, or, you know, exercise has to come from actually exercising. It's just it's a lot involved. But I think, you know, as I said, the overarching message from everybody here within the summit, and for so many people now, is that diet is just, you know, that's the number one. If we get that right, generally we'll have enough energy and enough clear thinking to progress and see, you know, other things. And because we sleep better, when we're eating better, we're feeding our body what it needs to be fed to be nourished and to be healthy, and it kind of just all flows on from there.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And then we're exercising more, because if you don't get a good sleep, your motivation to exercise is through the floor. You don't eat well if you're not getting enough sleep. That's all bi-directional. But you sort of think of this whole game of life, you know, just think of it like, I don't know, stepping up to a baseball pad, and you sort of like just, you know, get on with the things that you want to do with your life, whether it's growing world record pumpkins, changing the world, putting a dent in the universe. But you have to have a few things in place before you do that. You need to have, you know, your health needs to be fine so that you can go to work and do what you want to do. But, you know, for your health to be fine, you need to be eating well, you need to be sleeping well, you need to be exercising and, causing some stress. That's how we adapt and we become better. And if, there's something to be said for the load-bearing exercise to a certain degree as far as maintaining your bone health as well too. And that's possibly underestimated, which is probably why they're so busy recommending that we do weight-bearing exercise and do resistance training, especially as we get older as women. And I think that's really important as well too. So we don't experience bone loss and, muscle mass loss as well too. So there's all those sorts of things that are just really, really helpful as we age as women, that are becoming more and more important, that we actually take the time to do that, which means that you can actually turn up and swing your bat at life and go and do the things you want to do. Like what you do in health coaching is really, really important, and what we'll do in research is really important. And, what all of us are doing and what everyone's doing as far as the things they want to do with their life, whether it's create bridges, build beautiful buildings, create art, poetry, whatever. But you really do need to have a good bill of health so you can keep doing that and enjoy doing that through the life course. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Swing your bat at life. You've got to have you got to have it. I love it. I love it. And that's the thing. The way you've said that is so beautiful. I mean, there's no judgment on that. There's no agenda. It's just just the reality of it, and we take all the other stuff off and just look at it from that perspective. Well, it's common sense, really, isn't it?
It is. I started thinking about this because I went to a funeral a couple of months ago of someone who taught both my daughters at primary school, an amazing woman, and she died far too young at age 56. But, when we're at a funeral, we're not talking about how much she exercised or how much she slept or how she ate. We're talking about all the things that she gave to her family and gave to her kids by just being an awesome teacher of children. Like the sort of stuff she'd do is she'd teach them sarong classes and ballroom dancing, because she was sort of thinking, boys and girls still need to be talking to each other, so this is what I'm going to teach them to do. And she'd teach them Spanish. And so there were all these fun things that she did with all these kids. But when we got to a funeral, that's the stuff that we were talking about and, discussing when we were talking about her afterwards. And the funeral service was a beautiful funeral. I mean, it was obviously tragic, but beautiful because of the conversations you could have around her. But, what came through was how much she was giving and had given to other people, and how other people were going to learn from that and do that. But we're not discussing her basic health in that. And I think there's a lesson in that somewhere, isn't it? You just, you can keep on doing those things, though, if your health is fine and adequate, and which is what we're sort of all working in that space in anyway. Whether we're researching keto diets like Cliff is, and he's done some amazing work in that area. And the coaching is just so important as well, too. Yeah. Because we can eat all this protein, but, you can still sit down at night time. If there's a block of chocolate in the cupboard, what stops you from getting up and doing that? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Or sitting down to watch Netflix or something like that. And yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about the humanness of us. And, I think when you understand that we're really built to be, to conserve. If you think about things, we, and it's almost like I think we have to be aware of that to just sort of override it a lot of the times in our daily life. Our body's going to want to rest as much as possible. Our body wants to go for the easy option. Our metabolism wants the quick glucose. Everything's about this, easiest option, but that doesn't necessarily make it the best option, for us. And
yeah. And especially when you mentioned, we were looking at conserving, but then there's so much about the ultra-processed food environment and how these things are created that doesn't lend itself to any sort of conservation at all. I mean, you look at rubbish bins anywhere in town, it's full of plastic that food has been sold in. And it's, there's all that sort of element of it as well too. So we've got these very fast options where you can just actually pick a packet of something made of a range of things that actually don't look like food. I just call them things, and they're not good for you, but they encourage more consumption. I think some of that research around, how much do you actually eat when you're eating a diet high in ultra-processed foods, and you can actually fill a whole table full of it. Whereas if you're just having, a couple of eggs and some bacon, you're actually not having as physically much. If you put all the stuff on a set of scales, but the ultra-processed foods, especially when they're packaged in a way that encourages consumption at middle of the morning and then lunchtime, middle of the afternoon, and then into the evening, there's quite a lot of food there, and there's nothing that's conserving or conservation about that at all, is there?
No, and that's the interesting thing, the whole disconnect between, well, I'm actually doing better for the environment if I buy some sort of plant-based alternative or meat alternative, as opposed to eating the animal. Well, actually, if you think about it in terms of what you just said, it's a very bizarre thought to have, really, isn't it? Because it's not really...
the generation of physical rubbish of ultra-processed foods, that's not going to break down anywhere anytime soon either. So it's just another reason for, reducing or minimalising processed foods in your diet. So I think that's probably the main message for women, children growing up. I mean, we're not perfect, are we? I mean, younger adolescents get jobs, their own pocket money, then they go off with friends and do their own thing eating-wise. But I think if you just have the food that's in your house, that's nourishing and good, you work with that.
Yeah, I really like that. That's kind of how I've done it. My older two worked and my daughter still works at McDonald's. And, I say to clients and friends with younger kids, I said, really when they're that age, you have so much control. I kind of say to my kids, whatever's in the house, is yours. But, it's about, we'd always have discussions at dinner about, it's, the eggs for the brain and the, muscles, and, we connect it to, I'm going to start talking about teeth as well a lot more. I don't do that much, but I'm definitely going to start talking about that. But then, as you say, they grow up and, they go out with friends and, I guess you have to just hope that you've instilled, enough knowledge in them for them to make their choices, but you have to let it go. Like, I can't watch my older kids, as you can't watch them 24/7 with what they eat. But, I guess it's just a matter of trying to, do the best you can. We're always doing the best we can, with everything.
My friend Libby Jenkinson, who runs the Ditch the Carbs website and the low carb practitioners, she's amazing. But her go-to tenet is progress, not perfection.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Well, there's no such thing as perfection anyway. I mean, that's
just, and how boring and how righteous would that be?
I know, exactly. It's all made up. We make up this, internal bar about what perfection is and then berate ourselves when we don't meet it. But the whole thing's made up. So, let all that go. And, I think, as I said, if we come to each day with curiosity, with an open mind, I think really my big message is an understanding that we don't know everything. And,
we're still learning.
We're still learning. But the minute we think we know something, we're not going to be open to learning something. So, be playful, curious, know you're doing the best, but there's always more to see. And, I think, the more we're out of here, the more we'll, be guided by things like how amazing our body is. I mean, virtually every speaker has at some point talked about the just inbuilt resilience our body has. It's kind of like if we kind of feed it right most of the time, it will do its job for it. It will do it.
It'll clear acid out of your mouth. It'll digest food properly. It will, your teeth will be able to keep chewing, not breaking, and because of decay. And you can just actually, if you feed it well, and it's what you do the majority of the time that's really important. Life happens, but you just hop on the wagon. And I think that's where it's really sad when you see so many people have gone, well, I've tried all these diets and I've failed them all. And there's a whole lot of mindset around that. And so the whole food and image and that relationship with food has just been quite damaged, and it continues to cause damage as well too. And that's before we've even got into issues regarding food security for people who have been experiencing deprivation and how that plays out over time as well too, in ways that are hugely complicated. But, you know, we all are aiming for a nice, happy and good life. We were thriving and, you know, able to do the things you want to do. And so I think, you know, it's what you do the majority of the time. And, you know, and it's good to be knowledgeable and mindful about the effects of the ultra-processed food, but also how that's marketed to you as well too. Now, for instance, during the level 4 lockdown in New Zealand, when it was a strict lockdown, at 7 p.m. every night on a current affairs show, they'd have your family isolation games. And what that was is that you were to send in your video of what you and your family were up to physically and being physically active and all the rest of it. And it was sponsored by Pizza Hut. So the winner of that night's winner of the isolation games video got rewarded with vouchers for Pizza Hut, which were getting, you know, getting advertising at 7 p.m. when it's a family TV watching time. And you just sort of think, oh, there's just something quite wrong with this picture, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, our James Muki has done a lot to highlight people's awareness around all of that. I mean, he's talking the summits about how that happens in schools. You know, it's just they get them so young, and I think, you know, we just have to be aware of it because we can't change them. They're not going to change, but we can.
It's a movement that has to happen from the ground up, doesn't it? And it's on all of us to make those decisions. And that was something that came in the qualitative research that I did for my PhD, was that you know, you ask the kids, you know, they're eating life at home and their mums don't allow sugary drinks in the house, but then they'll go to a school fundraiser and their mum might be selling the sugary drinks at a food stall. Or then there's the other fundraisers that come in, like selling chocolate bars and lamingtons and pies. And so the food industry is essentially crashing into schools in those sorts of ways for, you know, fundraising opportunities. You know, for instance, you know, schools that don't get as much government funding then have to go and find the funding to, I don't know, build a shade sail over a playground or something like that. And so then they might run an athletic event, you know, such as a mountain biking event or a little triathlon, but there's fizzy drink being sold by their parents at this thing. And so, of course, that alters the kids' views of what's healthy and what's not. And one kid actually said, well, it's not like it's bad for you, like alcohol and cigarettes are, because, you know, we're not going to be selling cigarettes at a school fundraiser. But you're still thinking, well, actually, it is as harmful because these effects on the teeth and the liver and metabolically all the way through. But it's just a very slow form of harm being, you know, being experienced. So it's
that's right.
Yeah.
But cigarettes used to be healthy. Remember, the doctors used to smoke.
I know, camels.
And they tell their patients with, you know, anxiety or to have a cigarette. And I remember a story my sister-in-law told me about, you know, she was actually in hospital in Greece. And this was it was probably, I think it was like in the early 90s. And the doctor came and did rounds with his ciggy in his mouth. And she's just like, what are you doing?
Well, even in the early 2000s, everyone was still smoking in restaurants over there as well too. And, you know, so those were public health messages that were a bit slower to take off there in other places. But, I mean, we're around the same age, but back in our late teens and early 20s, there were still things like Rothman's Triathlon, and you know, the golf tournaments were sponsored by cigarette companies, and alcohol companies were sponsoring all sorts of things. And
the cricket.
The cricket, and rugby, and so now we've sort of looked and realised that's not a good idea. But in Taupo, which is where I'm living, we have the Ironman New Zealand event here every year, and it's sponsored by Nutrigrain.
It's the same here. Ironman food. I can't think of anything less Ironman food. Nutrigrain.
Especially when Ironmen actually do really, really well on low-carb diets, and the work of Dr. Dan Plews is actually really good. He was organised a business called Endure IQ, and he held the age group of, I think he still holds the age group world record at Hawaii, and he did that on a low-carb diet, and so, which is quite remarkable. But that, you know, that they that, you know, there's still all that sponsorship by these cereal companies. So we've got work to do, don't we?
We do. Well, Sarah, it's been so lovely to talk to you. I probably
Oh,
should
it's
let
been
you
lovely
go.
talking to you too. We could keep going, couldn't we?
I know we could.
Yeah.
There's so many areas, but maybe you could finish by sharing, a final message with the people watching. Just something that you might like to say to them. Anything?
Yeah, just insofar as health through the life course, we do know that do look after your teeth. The poor dental health and poor general health is related through a common dietary cause. So it's just really important to reduce your consumption of ultra processed foods, and that includes your really high sugar foods, but also your savory carbohydrate based snacks. And so when you do omit those out of your diet and naturally increase your intake of whole unprocessed foods or minimally processed foods, you're going to experience all sorts of health benefits. And the dental caries is really important because poor dental health does have a huge impact at all stages of the life course, from when you're very, very young or when your children are very, very young till we all get to old age eventually and hopefully. But if we all want to keep our teeth and become long in the tooth, and there's a story around that too, just eat a diet of minimally processed foods the majority of the time, and you'll get some really good progress as well too towards better health, which is what we're all looking for.
Oh, fantastic, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time and for being a part of this. I can't thank you enough. It's just been so
it's been really good
fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah.
it has. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to put below, obviously, ways people can contact you. And there'll probably be some links that you might like to share with the audience too, like on your research or on anything.
Yeah.
Are you happy for me to put some stuff in there below as well? Because I think it is an area that people will be really interested to delve more in.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, even at some of these landmark conferences on food and nutrition and health that were run by the BMJ, oral health didn't even get a mention. And if the word oral was in there, it was in words like, it was part of an author's surname, or it was in words like mayoral or temporal or doctoral or anything like that. I mean, I got excited when I saw 16 mentions of oral, and then I sort of found out it wasn't even about oral health at all. And you just sort of think it's just really important, because our food is the first place that our food hits. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay then, Tracy. Well, thank you. It's been lovely chatting.